On June 7, 1917, a barber's son was born at 319 South 6th Street in Steubenville, Ohio, and given the name Dino Paul Crocetti. He worked the steel mills first, like his father expected. He boxed under the name Kid Crochet, briefly and without distinction. He dealt blackjack in a Water Street speakeasy, where the customers tipped in cash the city never taxed and the state never saw. Crocetti left for the nightclub circuit and came back famous. Not as Crocetti, but as Dean Martin, one of the most recognized entertainers in the world. Another dealer worked those same tables under the name Dino Cellini and left for a different kind of fame, running mob-linked casinos in Havana alongside Meyer Lansky and Santo Trafficante Sr. Two men, same street, same trade, same town. One became a household name, the other became a footnote in Senate testimony. Steubenville produced both from the same rooms, in the same years, under a city government that took its cut and asked no questions. This is the story of what a town built when Water Street stayed open for 50 years, and who it made along the way. Chapter 1. The Fort and the Crossing. But before there was a Water Street, before there was a Dean Martin or a Dino Cellini, or a city built on two economies running side by side, there was a river bend and a fort that lasted 3 years. The fort came first, and everything the town would eventually become. The mills, the card tables, the boy from South 6th Street, sits downstream of that first decision about where to put it. In February of 1787, a U.S. Army officer named Major John Hamtramck marched a company of soldiers to a bend on the west bank of the Ohio River and built a log fort on the bluff above the water. His orders were narrow and specific: protect the federal surveyors, who were fanning out through the wilderness south and west of the river, laying out the 7 ranges, the first tract of land the United States government had ever organized, measured, and sold by public survey. The survey needed protection because the land was still contested, still native ground by any practical measure, and a chain of soldiers and blockhouses was the only thing standing between the surveyors and the people whose hunting grounds they were dividing into 6-mile squares. Hamtramck's fort had no name at first. He gave it one for a Prussian officer he had likely never met, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the drill master who had spent the brutal winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge, turning Washington's starving, half-trained Continental Army into something that could stand and fight a European power. Fort Steuben, they called it. The 7 ranges themselves were not incidental. They were the first working test of the rectangular survey system the young republic would use, with only minor variation, to divide and sell nearly every acre of public land it would go on to acquire west of the Appalachians. For a few years, the fort, the garrison, and that survey line were the entire town. The fort did not last. It burned in 1790, only 3 years after Hamtramck's men finished it, and no one rebuilt it. The surveyors had largely finished their work by then, and the garrison's reason for existing had thinned out along with them. For 7 years, the bluff above the crossing held nothing but ash, a cleared field, and a name nobody had any further use for. Bezaleel Wells looked at that same ash and saw a town. In 1797, Wells and a partner named James Ross surveyed and platted a new settlement directly on the ground where the fort had stood, and the reasoning was not sentimental. It was the same reasoning that had put the fort there in the first place. The valley floor was fertile river bottomland, wide enough to lay out streets, and building lots without climbing the bluffs behind it, and the Ohio narrowed at that exact bend into one of the more reliable natural crossing points on the upper river, the kind of geography that decides where a town will grow before a single deed gets signed. Wells staked the lots. Ross drew the boundaries. Neither man was inventing a location so much as reading one. The river had already told anyone paying attention where a town belonged. and Hamtramck's surveyors had confirmed it a decade earlier without meaning to. Between them, Wells and Ross kept the fort's name for the town that replaced it, Steubenville. The paperwork caught up with the platting quickly. On July 29, 1797, the new town was named the seat of newly formed Jefferson County, not the oldest settlement in the territory, not yet the largest, but the one sitting on the crossing that surveyors, soldiers, and settlers had already been using for a decade. For more than 5 decades after that, Steubenville grew the way county seats grew in the Northwest Territory and then the state of Ohio. A courthouse, a market square, brick slowly replacing log along streets that still followed the lines Wells and Ross had drawn on the ashes. In 1851, the town incorporated as a city. 54 years is not a long time, as founding stories go. It was enough time for a fort to burn, a town to be platted on what was left of it, and a county seat to become a chartered city under Ohio law. It was nowhere near enough time to become what Steubenville was about to become next. Chapter 2. Iron Along the River. By 1817, the county seat that Bezaleel Wells and James Ross had platted 20 years earlier was no longer simply a courthouse and a market square. It was a river town, and along the bank below, the bluff where Fort Steuben had once stood, the first furnace fires went up. The ironworking that began that year was modest. Small furnaces, small crews, iron pulled from the ground and worked by hand into bar stock and tools for a county still clearing its own forests. It was not an industry yet. It was barely a trade. But it was the first time the Ohio River at Steubenville carried iron instead of survey chains and settlers' flatboats, and the valley did not go back to what it had carried before. The fort that once stood on that same bluff had existed to protect a survey line. What came after it existed to feed a furnace. 39 years later, the iron trade in Steubenville stopped being modest. In 1856, a partnership calling itself Fraser, Kilgore and Company built a rolling mill on the riverbank. Not a furnace this time, but a mill. The machine that took raw iron and rolled it into the sheet and rail stock an industrializing country actually needed. Steubenville had produced iron in some form for nearly 4 decades. It had never before had a mill built for the purpose of doing it at scale. A rolling mill, once built, does not run quietly. It hires labor by the hundreds. It draws ore and coal up and down the river on a schedule that does not stop for weather or for market slumps. Fraser, Kilgore, and Company's mill marks, in the plainest terms available, the year a riverside iron trade became something closer to a modern steel industry. The next 43 years belonged to consolidation, the way they did across the entire Ohio Valley in that stretch of American industrial history. Furnace by furnace, mill by mill, the small ironworks that had grown up along both banks of the river were absorbed into larger operations with larger capital behind them. By 1899, the company doing the absorbing on the Steubenville side was LaBelle Iron Works, headquartered across the water in Wheeling, West Virginia. LaBelle was not a Steubenville company that happened to do business elsewhere. It was a Wheeling company that happened, by 1899, to run 2 full blast furnaces on the Steubenville riverbank, and it ran them as part of an operation that no longer began or ended inside a single town or a single state. Ore came down the river, coal came down the river, rail stock and sheet iron went out on it. Steubenville had stopped being a place that made iron for itself. It had become one link, a heavily capitalized and well-built link, in somebody else's chain, and the somebody else lived on the other bank. And then, in 1920, that link changed hands again. LaBelle Iron Works merged into the newly formed Wheeling Steel Corporation, folding Steubenville's furnaces, mills, and workforce into a regional steel giant that spanned both banks of the Ohio and both sides of the state line. The city's mills no longer answered to a company that merely lived across the river. They answered to a corporation built to run an entire stretch of the valley as a single operation. The furnace, the mill, and the men who worked both folded into one entry in a ledger kept somewhere outside Jefferson County. 103 years after the first furnace fire went up on that riverbank, Steubenville had become, without qualification, a steel town. Blast furnaces, rolling mills, a corporate merger. 3 separate proofs of the same fact, arriving 30 and 60 years apart, all pointing the same direction. The steel was real. The furnaces were real. The mill was real. The payroll that grew alongside them was real. None of it is in dispute, and none of it explains the whole of what those same decades built in Steubenville. Because along those same riverside streets in those same years, the 1800s hardening into the 1900s, the mills running day and night, something else was also taking shape. It kept its own ledgers. Nobody filed them with the state. Exit Chapter 3. Water Street. The second ledger was not a metaphor. It was an actual set of books, kept in the back rooms of Water Street gambling houses, recording wagers and payoffs and protection money in figures that never reached a Jefferson County tax assessor or a state auditor. The 18th Amendment had taken effect nationally on January 17, 1920, and the Volstead Act supplied the enforcement mechanism behind it, a mechanism that federal agents, chronically undermanned across the entire Ohio Valley, could never make stick. Prohibition did to Steubenville what it did to river towns up and down the Ohio. It did not invent the liquor, the gambling, or the trade in women that had already operated there at a smaller scale for decades. It organized them. Water Street, the row of buildings running along the riverbank below the bluff where Fort Steuben had once stood, became the address for all 3, operating within a few blocks of blast furnaces that never stopped running. Gambling houses filled the storefronts and the rooms above them. Bootleg liquor moved through the same buildings, brought upriver and down by the same barges that had once carried ore and rail stock for LaBelle Iron Works. Prostitution operated out of rooms rented by the week, a fact the Water Street trade never dressed up as anything else. The 3 ran together in the same square blocks under the same arrangement, and the arrangement had a single condition attached to it. The local police did not look for any of it. None of the 3 businesses hid its purpose from the men paid to police it. They did not need to look far. Water Street ran 7 blocks from the courthouse that Bezaleel Wells's platting had put at the center of town. That condition is the fact that matters more than any single house or dealer. A city government whose courthouse sat within walking distance of Water Street chose year after year not to close it. The Steubenville Police Department chose year after year not to arrest the men running it. Neither choice required the arrangement to hide. Everyone in Jefferson County who wanted to place a bet or buy a drink after hours knew exactly which door to use, and so did every patrolman who walked past that door on his beat. This was not corruption practiced in shadow and uncovered years later by an investigator with a flashlight. It was corruption practiced in daylight, a short walk from the building where the law of Jefferson County was written down and filed. The arrangement did not hide. It did not need to. By the early 1930s, the rackets on Water Street answered to one man. Local histories name him as Jimmy Tripodi, a boss who controlled the gambling houses, the liquor routes, and the numbers games run out of cigar stores scattered across downtown Steubenville. The cigar stores were the front, storefronts that sold cigars and newspapers over the counter and took bets on horse races and the daily number in the back room, one storefront after another, block after block, each one indistinguishable from an honest tobacco shop, unless a man already knew which door to use. Tripodi's rackets did not compete with the steel mills across the river. They ran alongside them, drawing on the same mill payroll every Friday, cashing the same paychecks the furnaces had just produced. A blast furnace and a numbers game in Steubenville in the early 1930s kept roughly the same hours. Nobody in Jefferson County ever filed that second ledger with the state, and nobody in Jefferson County ever had to. Water Street's economy was, by the early 1930s, as organized and as reliable as the mills that funded it. A parallel payroll running through cigar stores and card rooms instead of furnaces and rolling stock, collected by men the city government had already decided not to see. The mills answered to Wheeling Steel. Water Street answered to Tripodi. Both answered, in the end, to a city government that had already made its choice and never bothered to write it down. 2 blocks off Water Street on South 6th Street, a barber from Montesilvano, Italy, had opened a shop and started a family. Chapter 4. 2 Dealers. Gaetano Alfonso Crocetti was a Montesilvano-born barber who had crossed an ocean and settled 2 blocks off Water Street, close enough to hear the cigar store bookmakers taking bets through the wall of his own shop. He married Angela Barra, and on June 7, 1917, the two of them had a son at 319 South 6th Street, Dino Paul Crocetti. The household ran in Italian. Gaetano cut hair in Italian. Angela raised the boy in Italian. 2 ledgers ran through Steubenville by then, one kept by Wheeling Steel and one kept by Tripodi, and the Crocetti household kept neither. It simply lived within earshot of both, the furnace whistle from one direction, the shuffle of cards from the other. The son who grew up 2 blocks from the busiest illegal economy in eastern Ohio did not speak a word of English until the Steubenville public schools required it of him. That is the household South 6th Street produced, a barber's trade, an immigrant mother tongue, and a city outside the door already keeping 2 sets of books. Water Street trained its boys the way the mills trained their men. Fast, indifferent to a family's last name, and mostly toward nothing more than the next shift or the next hand. The mill took Crocetti first. Like nearly every able-bodied young man in Steubenville in the 1930s, the teenage Crocetti found work in the steel operations that had absorbed the riverbank since Fraser Kilgore's day. Hot, hourly labor that asked no questions. It did not hold him. Within a few years, he had crossed those same 2 blocks and taken a seat behind a blackjack table in one of the gambling houses that answered to Tripodi, dealing cards to mill workers spending Friday's pay before Saturday arrived. He put on gloves under the name Kid Crochet, briefly, without much distinction beyond the name itself. He worked the mill, he dealt the cards, he wore the gloves. None of the 3 kept him. By the time he left for the nightclub circuit running through Ohio's larger cities, Dino Paul Crocetti had already tried steel, cards, and boxing, and discarded all 3 in turn. The boy from South 6th Street became Dean Martin. Steubenville never saw him move back. Not every dealer at those Water Street tables left for a nightclub stage. Dino Cellini worked those same rooms, dealing to the same mill workers who filed through on Friday nights. And when he left Steubenville, he went south instead of east. He surfaces next in Havana, running the casino floor at the Riviera and later the Tropicana. Mob-linked operations he helped operate alongside Santo Trafficante Sr. and Meyer Lansky, the men then assembling the American gambling interests that controlled pre-revolution Cuba. No local paper wrote Cellini up the way Steubenville would later write up Martin. There was no stage name to print, no festival to name after him. He never became a household word. He became instead a name attached to 2 of the largest casino floors in the hemisphere and to the men who ran them alongside him. The arithmetic holds regardless. A Water Street dealer, trained at the very tables Crocetti had just left, ended up running gaming rooms on a scale Water Street itself never approached. 2 dealers worked those tables in the same years and split from there. One carried a stage name into American living rooms. The other carried a house rule from Water Street to Havana, and from Havana, eventually, to Las Vegas. A direct pipeline ran from a small Ohio river town to the casino floors of Havana and Las Vegas, built on the same cigar store bets, collected by the same police who had already decided not to look. Both men were still young men on Water Street when this chapter of the story ends. Crocetti not yet Martin, Cellini not yet a name in a federal file. Still dealing to mill workers who had no idea what either of them would become. Water Street itself had not yet reached the years it would be remembered for. Those years, and the number of people who would call Steubenville home when they arrived, were still coming. Chapter 5. The Take. By 1940, Steubenville had climbed to the top of every curve it would ever climb. The census that year counted 37,651 people, a record the city has not touched since, packed into a valley 3 miles wide with steel mills stacked along both banks of the Ohio. Wheeling Steel's furnaces, yet the same operation that had swallowed LaBelle Iron Works 2 decades earlier, ran at full capacity, day shift into night shift into day shift again, absorbing every able body the county could send it. The mills did not distinguish between a Water Street dealer's son and a deacon's son. They took whichever hands showed up at 6 in the morning. More steel meant more payroll. More payroll meant more players. More players meant a second economy running alongside the first, taking its percentage the way the mill took its tonnage. Local boosters counted the mills. Nobody kept an official count of what Water Street brought in, though the men who ran it kept their own books, meticulously, the way any going concern does. Population, output, employment. By every measure, Steubenville had never been bigger. It would never be this big again. Picture Water Street on a Saturday night in 1946. The cigar stores that front for the numbers game keep their doors open past midnight. Their windows lit the same amber as the mill 3 blocks over that never goes dark. Cars line the curb with plates from West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky. Men who drove for hours toward a dice table Steubenville's own police were paid not to see. Dice hit felt. A jukebox runs somewhere behind a beaded curtain. Cigar smoke and river coal smoke settle into the same low cloud over the block. A street that had been an ordinary row of storefronts 30 years earlier now ran on the mill's clock and answered to nobody but the men who owned it. Someone had tried to stop this once. In the 1920s, a Steubenville mayor ordered every piece of gambling paraphernalia removed from the city within 48 hours. Dice wheels, slot machines, cards, gone from every storefront on Water Street, by order of the office meant to police it. Local papers ran the order as proof the city had finally cleaned itself up. The order was obeyed briefly, publicly, and completely. Within weeks, the games were running again at the same tables, run by the same men, as if the 48 hours had never happened. No one was prosecuted. No one resigned. A mayor made a gesture, and a racket's economy shrugged it off. Nothing that came after was slowed by it at all. That failure was local and quickly forgotten. The next one was not. In 1950 and 1951, the U.S. Senate's Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce, the Kefauver Committee, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, turned its attention to the gambling towns of the Ohio Valley, and among the men it called was Mo Dalitz, a casino operator with financial ties to protected illegal gambling operations across the region. The committee's hearings ran in cities across the country for more than a year, and Dalitz's name surfaced alongside operations the panel traced from Cleveland to Newport to Havana, broadcast into millions of American living rooms. The first organized crime investigation most of the country had ever watched on television. Steubenville's Water Street stopped being a private arrangement between a mayor's office and a cigar store bookmaker. It became a line in a national record, cited beside the same interstate networks that ran through the Havana casino floors a Water Street dealer from this city already knew well. By then, 2 other stories that had started on these same blocks were already running far ahead of Water Street itself. One was underway 30 miles down the river, where Wheeling Steel was about to become something larger than the company Steubenville had always known. The other was playing nightclub stages in New York and Los Angeles, under a name Steubenville had not given it and would not fully claim for years. Neither had circled back to the city yet, and Water Street, for the moment, kept running exactly as it had for 30 years. Chapter 6. Both Reputations. In June 1968, Wheeling Steel merged with Pittsburgh Steel to form the Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel Corporation, and the numbers that resulted put every earlier claim Steubenville had made about itself into a different category of fact. The new company ranked 9th among steel producers in the United States, with annual capacity above 3 million tons. That put it ahead of older, better-known names in cities twice Steubenville's size, on the strength of a workforce that had started, a century earlier, as a handful of stacks on one riverbank, and a payroll that by 1968 ran into the tens of thousands across the valley. Its plants no longer sat in one city or even one state. They ran 30 miles along the Ohio River, from Benwood, West Virginia, to the same riverbank mills Steubenville had built its economy around since Fraser, Kilgore's rolling mill, first went up in 1856. LaBelle Iron Works had folded into Wheeling Steel in 1920. Now Wheeling Steel itself had folded into something larger, and the Steubenville mills, that had once been an independent rolling operation, were 3 corporate mergers removed from the men who had built them. A handful of furnace stacks had become one link in a chain of steel running the length of the valley, counted in the annual reports of a company whose headquarters were no longer, in any meaningful sense, Steubenville's own. To the men clocking in that June, the work itself had not changed. Same heat, same river, a start time nobody needed a clock to know. Dean Martin, the mill hand and card dealer from South 6th Street, spent those same years becoming one of the most recognized entertainers in the country. By the late 1950s, 3 names filled the marquees at the Sands in Las Vegas, filled television screens across the country, and filled magazine pages that had never once mentioned Water Street or Wheeling Steel. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., the founding trio of what the press had started calling the Rat Pack. Sinatra ran the room. Davis sang, danced, and played, sometimes in the same 8 bars. Martin drank on stage, or appeared to, and told jokes in a voice that still carried, underneath the polish, the cadence of the house on South 6th Street, where he had learned English secondhand. By 1965, he had his own weekly variety show on NBC, watched in tens of millions of American homes, and a string of films behind him that had nothing to do with steel or cards. Of the 3, only Martin had once dealt blackjack for a living, 2 blocks from where he was born. He had left Steubenville young, with nothing settled but a stage name, and by the time the Rat Pack was filling the Sands nightly, he had still never come home. Not for a visit that made the papers, not to stay. Through the 1950s and into this new decade, Steubenville carried both of its reputations at once, and neither one canceled out the other. It was a steel town that, by tonnage, outproduced cities with twice its population, its mills now folded into one of the largest producers in the country. It was, in the same years, a name reporters used as shorthand for a city run on the side by men nobody had elected, a place where the police took a cut, the cigar stores fronted for bookmakers, and the arrangement had already survived a mayor's 48-hour order and a Senate committee's television cameras without losing a single table. Out-of-town papers ran both stories about Steubenville in the same decade, sometimes in the same year. One about tonnage records on the Ohio River, the other about a grand jury looking into Jefferson County gambling. Neither story mentioned the other. Steubenville did not choose between the 2 identities. It held both, the way a set of books can carry 2 columns that are never asked to agree with each other. By every measure that mattered on either side of that ledger, it was a hard-working city. And then, in ways nobody in Steubenville marked on a calendar at the time, both columns quietly stopped climbing. Chapter 7. The Mills Go Quiet. The trouble that finally caught up with Steubenville in the late 1970s did not start in Steubenville. It started overseas, in mills built new after 1945 in Japan, West Germany, and later South Korea, running modern equipment against furnaces along the Ohio that had been laying down tonnage since before the First World War. It started, too, in the plain arithmetic of maintenance deferred for decades on structures that had never been engineered to last a century. Imported steel undercut American steel on price, region after region, and American producers answered less by rebuilding the oldest lines than by closing them. By the early 1980s, the American steel industry had idled more than 150,000 workers nationwide, a number that did not distinguish between a furnace operator in Youngstown, a roller in Pittsburgh, or a man on the line in Steubenville who had never worked anywhere else. The layoffs did not arrive as a single event. They arrived as a schedule, plant by plant, shift by shift, spread across a decade. Then, in 1985, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel Corporation filed for bankruptcy. This was not a struggling competitor going under somewhere else in the Rust Belt. This was the company under whose name Steubenville's furnaces had operated for 17 years, and whose predecessor names, Wheeling Steel and before that LaBelle Iron Works, had run those same furnaces back to 1899, the anchor employer that had defined the city's economy for a century by any name it happened to be filing under that decade. For a workforce whose fathers and grandfathers had clocked in under 3 different corporate names on the same riverbank, the filing did not read as a change of ownership. It read as the end of something that had never, in anyone's living memory, seemed like it could end. Thousands of mill jobs in the Ohio Valley disappeared over the following years. The mills did not go dark in a single afternoon. Furnace by furnace, shift by shift, year by year. They went quiet enough that the sound stopped being something Steubenville measured its days by. Men who had planned on the mill the way their fathers had, a lifetime job, passed down like an address, spent 1985 finding out that plan no longer existed. Wheeling Pittsburgh did not vanish outright in that first bankruptcy. It emerged, changed hands, and spent the following decades being reorganized, resold, and broken into pieces. Plants bought individually now, rather than held together as one integrated producer, a process closer to a slow liquidation than to any single sale. What had once run as one company along 30 miles of riverbank from Benwood to Steubenville became, piece by piece, entries on someone else's ledger, owned by whichever buyer's balance sheet could absorb a mill that decade. The last of it was gone by 2013. The vice economy that had survived a mayor's 48-hour order in the 1920s and a United States Senate committee's television cameras in 1951 did not survive this. Nothing about its decline resembled a raid, a headline, or a single night when the tables went dark for good. Instead, over those same years, federal organized crime prosecutions worked through the networks that had once tied Jefferson County's bookmakers to the interstate operations the Kefauver Committee had traced to Cleveland and Havana. At the same time, the population that had once made the drive from West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky worth taking was shrinking, mill layoff by mill layoff, and shrinking with it both the players at the tables and the disposable income that had kept the cigar stores open for half a century. Water Street did not close so much as run out of customers and cover at the same time. It was the second half of the same sentence the mills had already started. By the time the last piece of Wheeling Pittsburgh's name left the valley, Steubenville had spent nearly 30 years losing in overlapping waves the 2 things that had defined it since the census of 1940, the mill payroll and the money that payroll had always fed downtown. What the city looked like once both had finished draining out was not something anyone in Steubenville needed to imagine. By the next decade, they were living in it. Chapter 8. What Remains? Steubenville's population today stands at 18,161, according to the 2020 census. A little less than half of the 37,651 people who filled the city at its 1940 peak, when the mills ran 3 shifts around the clock and Water Street ran nearly as many hours beside them. A poverty rate near 25% now describes a city that neither version of the old Steubenville, the one built on tonnage, the one built on cards, would have recognized as its own. The mills are gone. The gambling houses are gone. What is left is a smaller city on the same streets where two economies once ran side by side and where both, eventually, ran out of everything that had kept them running. A reconstructed Fort Steuben stands today on the bluff above the river, a museum built on the exact ground Major Hamtramck's soldiers cleared in 1787 to shelter the surveyors laying out the 7 ranges. Nothing of the original survives. The fort burned in 1790, and what stands now was raised from historical drawings and the archaeological record, not from any timber old enough to remember the fire. Visitors walk through blockhouses built to resemble ones that lasted 3 years the first time and have already stood considerably longer the second. Bazaleel Wells platted his town on the fort's ashes in 1797 because the ground was already proven. A century and a half later, Steubenville proved it again, building a museum on the same bluff, for the same reason nobody ever stated outright. Because a river crossing is worth marking, whatever happens to sit on top of it. Downtown, more than 25 murals now cover the sides of the same brick buildings that once fronted for a cigar store bookmakers, part of a public art effort that has turned the city's blank walls into the most photographed thing left in it. One of them, painted by the artist Robert Deaver, covers a wall several stories tall with the faces of the Rat Pack, Sinatra, Davis, and Martin, the boy who once dealt blackjack 2 blocks from where his own painted face now looks down on South 6th Street. He never moved back to Steubenville while he was alive. In paint, he never left it. Every year, Steubenville hosts a Dean Martin festival built around the mill and the murals already commemorate. Drawing visitors downtown for a weekend, the city has spent years learning how to use. The Harmonium Project, a revival effort launched in 2014, works the rest of the calendar, storefront by storefront, filling the retail space that the steel layoffs and the shuttered gambling houses both left standing empty at the same time. It is not rebuilding what Wheeling Pittsburgh was or what Water Street was. It is finding some other use for the buildings, both of them left behind. It is slower work than either industry's collapse, and it has already taken longer. The Ohio River still runs past the bend where Wells drew his lots on the fort's cleared ground, the same bend Hamtramck had chosen for a garrison a decade earlier, the same bend that put a rolling mill on the bank in 1856 and a card table on Water Street not long after. It is brown and wide, and it moves at the unhurried pace of a river that has never once been in a hurry. Past the rebuilt blockhouses and the painted Rat Pack and the quiet frontage of the mills. It carried barges loaded with pig iron in 1899 and carries pleasure boats now, and it has never distinguished between the 2 kinds of cargo or noticed that the city on its bank went up twice and came down twice while the water itself did nothing but pass through. It is still, this morning, only a river, moving south the way it did before Steubenville had a name.